So, welcome to today's Chia Logician podcast. Today, you've just got me, Michael Max, with a solo show. I want to spend a little time talking with you about some of the herbal methods that I learned when I was living in Taiwan. There's some unique things that they do in Taiwan, and I was very fortunate to, in my time there, find an old doctor who was very, very generous with me and took me under his wing, let me sit in his clinic. He taught me what he knew. The staff at his clinic were kind to me. They helped me to be able to read his handwriting, which was so extraordinarily grass script in the writing that basically the only people that could understand it were probably like his family and the women that worked fulfilling his herbs, and eventually me, because I finally learned how to read it. But it was pretty funny because most of the people that would come to see him, they'd see him writing down these formulas on a piece of paper that would eventually go to the herb girls out front. And they'd look at it and they had no idea. They just couldn't read it. And so it was pretty funny at times being able to read his writing even when the Taiwanese people couldn't. But, you know, like anything, and especially with Chinese and learning Chinese, I have found that because the vocabulary is fairly limited, when you think about any technical language, it may have some fancy words, it may have some unusual words from what you would usually like use in a newspaper or a magazine article. But the nice thing about a technical language is that the vocabulary is fairly limited. And so once you learn the vocabulary, it's easy to hear it. And it's not hard to recognize it when it's written, and when it's actually written, like, printed in a book. It's not that hard once you know the vocabulary. And then with something like his writing, because it was limited to particular formulas and particular herbs, after a while, you just get a feel for it. You learn how to see it. So, it's like anything. It's like any pattern recognition experience. You just expose yourself to it long enough. And, when you think about it, this is very much how we learn Chinese medicine and how we practice it. We learn the pattern language of Chinese medicine. And so part of what I want to share with you today is some of the pattern language of Chinese herbs, in particular treating respiratory issues, that I learned from my teacher, Dr. Jiang Tong, in Taiwan. So I moved to Taiwan in 2001 with the intention of learning enough Chinese that I could do some Chinese medicine. And I was very fortunate that there were some people that, first of all, suggested I first go to Taiwan to learn some Chinese. I'm glad I followed that advice. Taiwan's a fantastically interesting place to be and to live. And the schools there for learning Chinese are really quite good. I appreciated the teachers that I had there. The other great thing about Taiwan is that you will learn the traditional characters, which I have found to be helpful in a lot of ways because there's so much meaning that goes into the character. And in many ways, you'll be able to understand a character because you can see how the dang thing is put together. And you need the traditional characters often to see that kind of thing. So I got a chance to learn that in Taiwan, and there was a person that I met. She was also a Chinese medicine practitioner. Now, she had studied previously in Taiwan, and she already had some pretty good Chinese, but she was brushing it up at that point in time because she was going to head to the mainland, and we became pretty good friends. And it was, it's really helpful when you're in a new place to have someone who knows the ropes a bit. So I hadn't been there all that long, maybe a month and a half, something like that. And I got a cold. I got a really bad cold. Now, Taiwan in general, like many Asian countries, is fairly polluted. Taipei in particular, it's got tens of thousands of cars. I'm sure well over 1 million, maybe 2 million motorcycles. Holy smokes. Everybody there has a motorcycle, it seems. And it's in a basin. And so you get these temperature inversions and you can get some really terribly polluted situations going on there. You add up all the dust that gets kicked up by several million people living together in a small space in a very urban environment, and then just being new to a place where there's pathogens I've not seen before. I got really sick. Very bad cold, chest congestion, head congestion. Now, I have issues when I get colds, and I've had this since I was young. In fact, this is what took me to Chinese medicine in the first place, is that I would get these terrible coughs after having a cold. And I catch colds easily. Well, I used to. I still catch them to some degree, but, Chinese medicine is very, very helpful for this kind of thing. Anyway, I got this really bad cold, and I'm hanging out with my friend Catherine, and she says, hey, I heard about this old Chinese medicine doctor, Lao Zhongyi. Friend of mine told me about him. Why don't we go down and see him and have him prescribe some herbs for you? I need some medicine anyway. Let's go down. I'll translate for you, because she could speak Chinese at that point, and I knew enough to ask for the check at a meal. That was about the extent of my Chinese. So we go to visit this old doctor. He's down in Yonghe. It's this little area just south of Taipei City itself. They've got a fantastic subway system in Taiwan. And so we just got on a train and took it down to Yonghe and took about a 15-minute walk and ended up at this tiny little storefront. There's a lot of these storefront kinds of clinics in Taiwan. And you go in. There are no appointments, by the way. If you want to go see a Chinese medicine practitioner, you go there and you guahao. You go there and you get a number, and you're seen in the order that you came in. No such thing as an appointment for acupuncture or herbs when you're in Taiwan. So we got our number. We're hanging out on these little plastic chairs. There's a TV that's on. There's always a TV on and blaring somewhere in Taiwan, it seems. And at Dr. Jiang's clinic, it seemed that the girls that made up the herbs in the front and took the money and checked people's insurance and all that stuff, they loved the karaoke shows. So there was always some karaoke going on at Dr. Jiang's clinic. Anyway, we go in, sit down, and he looks at my tongue and he feels my pulses and he asks about my symptoms and this and that. And then writes out on a little piece of paper the formulation that he's got for me. Now, I'm there to learn some Chinese medicine. And so I have my friend Catherine help me with the herb girls up front translate just what he's prescribed. And what I find out is he has prescribed something like 4 or 5 different formulas. And then he's modified it with another 5 herbs. Now, I don't know about you, but in my studies of doing herbal medicine in the United States, no one had ever made up a formula like that. 5 different prescriptions modified with 5 herbs. Now, they use the concentrated granules there quite a bit. It's covered by the insurance system that's there. And by the way, Taiwan has probably one of the best healthcare systems in the world. It is a one-payer system, and it covers all your Western medicine. It covers your Chinese medicine. You get your teeth cleaned for like $3 or something ridiculous like that. You can get yourself some acupuncture, or you can go see Dr. Jiang. Well, I didn't have insurance at that time, so I was paying out of pocket, but it was still pretty darn cheap. At any rate, I take a look at what the herbs are that he has prescribed for me, and I'm thinking to myself, I know this guy's old, but he might be a little bit past his pull date. Again, I'm looking at a bunch of formulas modified with 5 herbs. And they come in these really cool little packages. So they're all pre-proportioned. You take them home, put them in some water, drink them, you're good to go. So I take these herbs back to my apartment, and I'm really suspicious of this formula because I've never seen anything like this before in my life. But, I'm there, and I'm not planning to leave until I got enough Chinese that I can kind of make my way in the world. So I take the herbs, I go to bed, and I'm actually really nervous, thinking I might have to go to a hospital or something tomorrow because it was a bad cold. As I said, I get a cold, the stuff goes to my chest. I would get these horrible, dry, hacking coughs, and they could go on for weeks, sometimes months. It was not pleasant. So I take these herbs, I go to bed. I sleep pretty well, which is good. I wake up the next morning, and I'm feeling about 80% better. It's quite remarkable, but I'm waiting for that dry cough, and I cough, and it's not dry. In fact, I've got a mouth full of gooey phlegm, which sounds disgusting. But for someone like me who has dealt with dry coughs my entire life, I thought this was a dang miracle, and it was. So I took his herbs. I got over that cold really quickly, and I was coughing nice, gooey phlegm out of my lungs for probably the next week or two. It was remarkable just how much gunk I was able to easily cough out of my lungs. And then, of course, the cough resolved pretty well. Needless to say, if I needed to get some medicine, I'd go down to Dr. Jiang. And Catherine would usually go with me in the beginning to translate. Eventually, I was able to go on my own. And it's a great way to practice, some Chinese medicine is go see a Chinese medicine practitioner and see if you can talk the medicine in the language. I would go to him as a patient. And then after about a year and a half, I thought, I'd like to study with this cat. And I asked him if I could sit with him, and he said, yes, come back tomorrow. And I came back, and he hands me this big stack of books. He's got the Shanghan Lun, the Jingui Yao Yue, the Bancao, and two others. I can't remember what they were off the top of my head. I know they're somewhere on my bookshelf still. And he said, read these and come to me with questions. And I would begin to sit with him. I go down like once a week and just kind of hang out in his clinic and watch him treat patients. And I did that for just a short amount of time because I got a great opportunity to go to Beijing and study some medicine there. And Beijing's a whole other adventure. I was there for about a year and a half. But after I got done in Beijing, I was a little homesick for Taiwan. And I didn't feel like I'd really finished my studies with Dr. Jiang. I just kind of began. And I called him up at one point to see if I could maybe sit with him and continue studying. And very graciously, he said, well, get here when you can. And so I found myself back there. And then for the next year and a half, I had this great opportunity to work with him. I'm going to share some of the main respiratory formulas that he used. And he saw lots of respiratory conditions. I would say it was actually his specialty. He also saw quite a bit of women's health, and then, the usual conglomerate of, achy joints and arthritis and some anxiety and, the usual things that you see. But there were a lot of people with allergies in Taiwan, and there were a lot of people that had respiratory issues. Again, you heard me talking a little earlier in this conversation about the air quality there. And you put that together with lots of wind, people riding on motorcycles. And then in the summer in particular, it's really interesting because it is hot and it is humid in Taiwan. I mean, it's just a sweat box there. But any place that is indoors is air conditioned, and it's air conditioned to the degree that it's like a meat locker. And so there's a lot of going like out into this super hot, damp environment where your pores open up and you begin to sweat, and then you go into these ice boxes to do your shopping or to a restaurant to have something to eat. And you can imagine the kind of dysregulation that would happen with the exterior. And so, it's not uncommon for people to have all kinds of respiratory issues year-round over there. And in the winter, it gets kind of cold and damp too. So it's a good place if you want to learn how to work on some lung stuff. Anyway, the formulas, I'm going to start in here with the main formulas that he used, and I'm going to go into them in a little bit more depth as well. The main formulas that he used were, and again, these are granules. He almost always, for respiratory issues, he used granules. Now, for women's health, he would sometimes use granules, and then he would add some raw herbs to those as well because he felt like it needed a little bit of an extra push. But for the respiratory stuff, he went with the granules. So the main formulas that he would use were Xin Yisan, Qingbi Tang, Xing Su San. There's a Taiwanese formula. I'll get into it here in a moment. Shi Shen Tang and Xin Yi Qing Fei Tang. These are the main ones that he would use. And again, he would group them together. It was like, you could think of a string quartet, right? You got each instrument doing its own thing. I think a lot of this way of working that they've got in Taiwan, as I understand it. It came from some Japanese influence, some of the Kampo influence. And because they've been using concentrated granules there for a long, long time, a lot of the doctors there will think of an herbal formula and just look at the function of that formula in the same way that you might think of the function of an individual herb. And so when they are combining different formulas together, they're not thinking about all the individual herbs in that formula. What they're thinking about is the function of that formula as a whole, as an entire gestalt. And then the modification comes from the individual herbs. He's got something really interesting here. I'll tell you about that in just a moment. But let's first talk about some of these formulations that he used. The main formula that was built into every single one of his respiratory creations that I ever saw was Xingsusan. Now, Xingsusan is not something that I learned about when I was studying herbs here in the United States. Maybe it showed up in a Wenbing class or something, or you can find it in your herb book, I'm pretty sure. But in Taiwan, this is a very, very popular, at least for Dr. Jiang, it's a very popular formula. And one of the things that I, with my dry lungs, very much appreciated about this is that it was a gently opening and dispersing formulation, but it's also a little bit cooling and it's also moistening. And for me, Xingsusan is like my savior. If you're dealing with anyone who's got dry kinds of coughs or dry respiratory conditions, Xingsusan is just a godsend. It's just wonderful. So he'd use that. That was like always the main one that he'd write. At the top of that little piece of paper that would eventually go over to the herb girls, he would always write Xingsusan. And then other formulas that he'd frequently add to it. If there was nasal congestion, he'd use Qingbi Tong. Qing means clear, Bi means nose, Tong, obviously decoction. Qingbi Tong is again, it's something that I saw in Taiwan. I don't know if we have it over here in the United States. These days I use another formula for clearing noses that also Dr. Jiang would use, which is Shinisan. And then Shinisan's cousin, Shini Qingfei Tong, which is very similar in that they both are dispersing of the nose and of the head. They're great for sinus conditions. The Qingfei Shinisan is a little bit cooler, and Dr. Jiang likes to use it if people had some coughs, especially if it was due to heat. So he would mix these together. It was interesting. He would write it out as Xingsusan 4, meaning 4 grams, and then he'd have his, the other ones would all be like 3 grams each. So if he was using like some Shisen Tong or some Qingbi Tong, that would come in at 3 grams. The thing that was interesting to me is that the girls that were putting, the herb girls, the herb xiaojia, that were putting his formulas together, they would look at those numbers and then like multiply it by the number of days that they needed to give the herbs, and then they would just, scoop it up. I never saw them use a scale. They've been doing this stuff so long, they could just eyeball it and basically get what they needed. They were amazing to watch, and they were fun to hang out with because while they weren't doctors, while they were people working behind the counter of an herb clinic, they actually each knew a lot about the herbs, partly because they've been working there with Dr. Jiang so long. And one of them actually had gone to school, Chinese pharmacology, and learned some herbs that way as well. But they were also a font of information for me. And sometimes I wouldn't understand what Dr. Jiang was doing with certain herbs, and I'd sit down and talk with them, and they'd explain it to me. So without the Xiaolaoshi, the little teachers, as I used to call them, I wouldn't have been able to learn nearly as much as I did. They were wonderful people. Anyway, they would mix these herbs up and then put them in this little machine that would put them into these little packets. And people would take them home and that they'd use them. I'm going to go through each of the main herbs that he would use and tell you that he used them for. And then I'm going to tell you about these 5 herbs that pretty much got added to every single formulation that he did if it had to deal with a respiratory condition. It was like these 5 magic little, they weren't really magic. Actually, I think they are kind of magic when I think about it. Anyway, more about that in a moment. So we already talked about the Xingsu-san. The other formula that went in almost every prescription, especially if there was an acute aspect to it, was a formula called Shi Tang 10 Spirit Decoction. I don't think I ever saw Dr. Jiang prescribe Ma Huang Tang. I think maybe only rarely saw him prescribe Gugan Tang. I don't think I ever saw him prescribe Guizhi Tang, which is interesting when you think about how often Guizhi Tang gets prescribed in the West. But I think in its place, if he's looking to release the exterior and he's looking for something kind of like what Gugan Tang would do or Ma Huang Tang would do, he uses Shi Tang. And it's got Zisuya, Gugan, Shengma, Chuanshong, Baizhi, right? Really nice for opening up the head. It also had a little bit of Ma Huang in it, some Baishao, Chenpi, Shangfu, Gansao, and then something that, of course, you would expect in most any formula that is dealing with exterior conditions, some fresh ginger, and then it also had some of the onion, the congbai in it. I really like this Shi Tang, and I use it quite a bit in my practice. I use it on myself, of course, if I'm not feeling well. Again, I don't know if this one is available in the United States. Last I looked, it wasn't, because generally speaking, what I will do is when I'm visiting in Taiwan, I'll buy a bunch of it and bring it back for myself and use it in the formulas. But if you can get your hands on it, and if you're dealing with respiratory conditions, this is a great formulation. Or you could just make it up yourself, right? Out of granules or from the raw herbs. When there was nasal congestion, his favorite go-to was something called Qingbi Tang, literally clear the nasal decoction. And this was great for inflammation of the sinuses. Again, I don't recall seeing this here in the United States. It's one of those that I've brought in the past. I'm out of it now, so I can't even look and tell you what's in it. But that is a fantastic formula. In almost every formulation, along with the Xingsu-san, he used the Shini-san. That was another one of his favorites. Not every time, but often enough. And often enough that I would say for the majority of respiratory formulas that I saw him write. The main one, of course, was the Xingsu-san. That was followed by Shi Tang, and then probably the Shini-san. Those were the big 3. I would almost always see those. And then depending on what else he saw, again, if there's nasal congestion, he used the Qingbi Tang. If there were some headaches, he'd use the Chuanshong Cha Tiao San. That was one that he liked to use, not just for headaches with respiratory conditions or colds and that kind of thing, but almost for any kind of headache. I'd often see him using that one. The Shini Qingfei Tang, he would use if there was a bit more phlegm, if there was more heat, and if there was coughing. If there wasn't coughing, he tended not to use that one. But if something had gone on for a while, it was like deeper in the body, he was a real fan of the Qingfei Shini-san. And then if a condition had gone on for a long time and there's some coughing and it hasn't resolved, he often would modify the formula by adding in Jinfei Caocan. And this was almost always used with some of his other favorite heavy hitters. He would just add that in if something had gone on for a long time. Now, I want to turn to these 5 herbs that he used to modify. Really, anytime I saw him do a prescription that had to do with respiratory issues, he would put in a little bit of Fang Feng, Jingjie, Baizhi, Yuxing Cao, and just a wee little bit of Xixin. The way that he explained this to me is that this combination will help to open up the exterior. It'll help to open up the pores. And even if somebody did not have what we would commonly call a condition that was stuck on the interior and you needed to diaphoresis it, even for somebody that had something deeper in their lungs and it was stuck in there, so it could be someone like me with like gooey dry phlegm, or somebody that might even have not dry phlegm, but it's deep and it's inside. He would use these 5 herbs to gently open up the exterior, because if the exterior was open, then the lungs could open and close a little more easily. You got to remember that the skin is considered the exterior of the lung. And so if the exterior, if the skin, if the pores are a bit contracted, the lung itself is not going to be able to function quite as well as it could as if you had those pores open and everything's moving and everything's literally breathing. So he'd add these in all the time. And he would just use, like, let's say he was using 4 grams of the Xingsu-san and maybe 3 grams of the Shirshan-tang. He would just add in like 1 gram of each of these, with the exception of the Xixin. The Xixin, it'd just be like a little dab. It'd be like 0.5 grams. It was like a little dusting, a little bit of a whisper of that amount in the herb that would go in there. And especially for issues that were kind of chronic, that involved the lungs, he would add in some extra of the Yuxing Cao. And one of the other things I found out about the Yuxing Cao that I learned when I was in Taiwan from some other practitioners is it would often be used as just kind of a beverage that people would drink. They would just take the leaves and spill some water on it and then just drink it as a tea throughout the day. It's almost like a folk medicine, the Yuxing Cao. Very, very helpful, I have found, in helping to clear up the lungs. And if there's any kind of chronic issue, it just seems really helpful for respiratory conditions. So again, those 5 herbs are Fang Feng Jingjie, Baizhi, right? That'll clear the nose. The Jingjie, the Fang Feng, they opening the exterior. The Yuxing Cao, it's just super helpful for your lungs. And then just a wee bit of Xixin just to kind of power the whole thing, just give a little bit of an oomph. Some other herbs that he would frequently use for coughs and respiratory conditions, especially where there's some phlegm or there's some dyspnea, shortness of breath, tightness in the chest, that kind of thing. If there's phlegm, of course, bansha, very common herb that is used for coughs. He would use that quite frequently. He was very fond of pipaye, and he liked to use xingren quite a bit. And, xingren's a great herb. It opens the lungs. It gets rid of phlegm. It helps to send the qi downward. Another one that he commonly would use is a little bit of chantui. Again, we're looking at dispersing wind from the exterior. We're looking at making sure the exterior is breathing well on its own, and then the lungs on the inside also will do better. Yeah, I would often see him use a combination of pipaye along with yuanzhi, because these would help to stop a cough, and the yuanzhi is good for dealing with the phlegm. The yuanzhi is nice too because it's got a little bit of heart nourishing aspect to it. Anyone who's not feeling well, or they've got some kind of chronic respiratory thing going on, their spirit's going to be a little bit disturbed, and so the yuanzhi is really nice for that. For the dry coughs, you want to get the phlegm more liquid so you can get it out. And often I would think of using herbs like Maimendong or Chuanbei Mu, but he wasn't so crazy about these. I mean, he did use Chuanbei Mu, but his admonition on that was you can only use it after the acute stage is over. It's only for more chronic issues. You do not want to use Chuanbei Mu or Zebei Mu either, for that matter, in the early stages of dealing with a respiratory condition. And while I always thought Maimendong was a good idea, and actually these days I still do use it to some degree, he was not keen on it. I don't think I ever saw him use Maimendong. I'd have to go back and look over some notes, but he was very cautious about cold substances and the influence of cold on the human physiology. And so when it came to cold herbs, he was quite cautious. But for phlegm and for dealing with phlegm, again, he was quite keen on the Xingren. He liked Jiang for all the good and obvious reasons, the Yuanzhi, and sometimes if there was a bit of heat as well, he'd use the Niubanzi. He liked that quite a bit. For coughs that were more wet, they were kind of phlegmy and hot, he would add in Jingfei Cao, and this is also where he doubled down on the Yuxing Cao. That was good stuff too, and you'd see him use it for the more phlegmy conditions as well. I find the Yuxing Cao, whether it's phlegmy or dry, it's just helpful for the lungs in general. So do consider that. Other cough herbs that I would see him use from time to time was qianhu, if he needed to dry things out a bit and open the exterior. He would use shigan on occasion, and chenpi was when that often would show up. Of course, chenpi and bansha together are a fantastic combination for dealing with phlegm. Now, after a cold or flu or some kind of condition where someone had been weakened, he would look to tonify a person's system after they had recovered. And the way that he would do this, he was very keen on Buzhong Iqitang, and he was very keen on Guipitang. These are two formulations that he often used as restoration of the system after people had been ill. And sometimes, if there was still a little bit of nasal congestion, he would also put in a little bit of the Qingbitang. Sometimes you'd see him do these things simultaneously, where he's beginning to tonify the system even as he's finishing up with getting, the last remains of mucus and, the dysregulation of fluids in order with the herbs that he'd like to use so much. I hope that you've found this to be helpful. I think Dr. Jiang's ideas of working with different formulations together is really interesting. I know that there are some other Taiwanese practitioners teaching here in the States that will do this kind of a perspective on treating different kinds of illnesses. And it's something worth thinking about. And it's especially a way of using the concentrated granules. I'm not going to say it's a traditional way of practicing Chinese medicine, but I would say that it is a uniquely Taiwanese way of using this fairly new technology of granules and combining it with the basic principles of our medicine. So this is something that you can work with. And again, a lot of us see people that have allergies and see people that have respiratory issues, asthma, all those kinds of things. And this is something that you can try out in your clinic. These formulas are all quite safe. They're not disgusting in terms of taste. Most of these herbs are not bitter, but tend to be more acrid. Some of them are a little bit sweet. Again, the Xingsusan is this delightful formula that will disperse and moisten at the same time. Moisten in a gentle way so that you're not creating more phlegm, that you're just making sure that the tissues are just the right kind of moisture. So often we're looking to balance the fluids in the body, and the lung being the upper source of fluids is a really important organ that we have to pay attention to when we're thinking about respiratory health and really when we're thinking about fluids in general. So thank you for listening. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me about this. I'm going to put together some notes that you can download. And there's also a couple of articles that I wrote or translated about Dr. Jiang. And those are in the Lantern. And the Lantern has graciously allowed us to reprint these, so to speak. And so they are available over on the website for you. And you can download those articles and read them. There's some other formulas that he talks about in those articles. And again, thanks to the Lantern for allowing us to share that with you. And I want to close with truly my deep, sincere thank you to Dr. Jiang, who really helped me to understand herbs for respiratory conditions in a different way that I don't think I ever could have found had I only studied in the States or had I only gone through the more traditional methods of looking at herbs for respiratory conditions. It's a funny karmic thing that my weak and often troublesome lungs, which is what took me to Chinese medicine, would somehow land me in the clinic of somebody who happened to not only be able to help me, but help me learn another way of looking at how to think about herbs and how to use herbs. His generosity was extraordinary. And again, the Xiao Sherman, the two women who worked behind the herb counter, they were extremely generous with me, and they had great senses of humor. It was so much fun to hang out. You know, one of the interesting things about a Taiwanese herbal clinic, like I said, you can't get an appointment. You have to go, you have to show up, you guahao, you get yourself a number, and then you sit there and hang out with the other people that are waiting to see the doctor. One of the things that I loved about Taiwan, I just love this to pieces, is that there was a very social aspect to the medicine. It's not like here in the States where we've got like all this privacy and you're sitting in the doctor's office and like nobody looks at anybody else and no one's supposed to even know who anyone is. And, you know, like all waiting to go in and confess our sins to the doctor. But it's the opposite of that in Taiwan. In Taiwan, people are gossiping out in the waiting room. They might be talking about, you know, the issues they have and the formulas that they've taken, or maybe they've got some advice. I've seen patients give each other advice on, you know, things to eat or things to do or things to try or do or not do, you know, all that kind of thing. There was this very, very social aspect to what was going on there. And I just loved that piece of it because it was, number one, it was just lively, but there was also something wonderful about people being at a doctor's office and they're connecting with other people. There was like an aspect of community that showed up between people in waiting for them to see Dr. Jiang that I found really sweet. And it just seems to me that when illness is normalized, instead of like, oh, I got this horrible thing, I got to get rid of it, and I'm on my own for it, that when you're in community and you're connected to other people and you're working on dealing with whatever health issue that you have, it just changes the context a bit. I got just one more thing that I want to mention here. Again, he saw a lot of women for menstrual issues, and more menstrual issues, menstrual and menopause, I would say, not so much fertility, but menstrual and menopause. One of the things that you see a lot in Taiwan is that when women go to see a doctor, at least an herbal doctor like Dr. Jiang, they go in pairs. So it'll be like two girlfriends, they'd both go to see him, or it'd be like a mother and a daughter. And again, unlike here in the West where each person goes and sees a doctor alone, these women would go in together and he'd be talking to one of them and the other one's sitting there, you know, waiting her turn. But what would be hilarious to me is he'd ask her about her diet or her this or her that or her, you know, her period, whatever. And the one woman would give an answer and the other woman, because she knows her so well, would jump in and go, no, Dr. Jiang, let me tell you how it really is, right? No, actually her digestion is not good. She's got these problems. These are the problems she has, blah, 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 right? Or a mother-daughter thing, right? They'd like rat each other out to the doctor. And when I first saw this happening, my first thought was, wow, these people, they're not very forthcoming. You know, it's a good thing they got someone else here to keep them honest. But in time, I came to realize that I was wrong about this, that it's not that people were trying to hide things, but more that we each have our own idea of who we are and how we are, and we have our own idea of how we respond to things, or our own idea of what good digestion is, or, you know, what a good or bad period is, whatever. And the people that are close to us, the people that know us, right? A mother-daughter or two girlfriends, two women that are just, they're pals. They know each other. They've been friends for a long time. They go see the doctor together, right? Sometimes the people that know us and know us well. They know more about us than we do. The blind spots that we have about us, they see it more clearly. And so eventually I began to see this as a really wonderful thing where two women would come in and you could really see how they cared for each other because they'd correct the other one in front of the doctor because they wanted their friend or their mother or their daughter to get better. And so they were there as part of the team. It was a really sweet and wonderful thing to see. And you might even notice this yourself. Sometimes family members will come in. I know on occasion, well, not during COVID so much, but I've had plenty of times where I've had like husbands and wives come in. And it's really helpful to have that other person's point of view. I like to invite them into the clinical encounter. I like to invite them in to sharing their perspective on what's going on for the person that they care about. There's a lot that you can gain and glean from the experience of someone who cares about somebody and is able to see their blind spots. So anyway, I think that's about it for today. It's thank you for sticking with me here. It's been delightful to take a little wander back through my time in Taiwan and appreciate all that Dr. Jiang gave to me and to be able to pass some of that along to you. I found his work to be very helpful, and I found his spirit to be so deeply supportive. He had a great sense of humor, and he would always remind me to 用心,专心, to be attentive and to concentrate on what you're doing.